other than the books of Genesis and Exodus and the book of the prophet Isaiah, at least in part, the book of Job may be for me the most important book in the Old Testament. I know we've been reading from Job for the last couple of weeks, at least you've been reading from Job this last couple of weeks while I was away on vacation. Of course, I followed along diligently from under the palm tree in Hawaii. Father Vincent, I know may have already talked about it, but we have a 3-year cycle of readings in the Episcopal Church, and so this will be my last chance to talk about Job in a sermon before my mandatory retirement as rector, at least in 2021, maybe. I may bring up the subject again just on a whim, but this is the last time we have this reading. The book of Job is fiction. It's meant to be fiction. Most of the Bible's not meant that way, but this is. It's a short story with a very important point to make. Like the book of Ruth, which we'll get to next week, which is a historical fiction, Job is a kind of protest literature. It's a minority opinion. It's saying to the ruling predominant view within Judaism, not so fast. Wait a second, look at this. The book of Ruth protests against the racism and xenophobia of the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, after the return from the exile in Babylon. The book of Job protests against the simplistic, judgmental moralism of the so-called, what's called the Deuteronomic Code, which was an interpretation of the Jewish law that came into effect during the reign of King Josiah in Jerusalem before the exile. I had an Old Testament professor in seminary whose main focus was on the book of Job. He'd been at the seminary for 20-some years of his 45-year ministry, and he'd written a couple books on Job. His name was Dr. Denton, not related to the thing with the flap in the back, but if anybody knows those. I never knew his first name. It's just Dr. Denton. I tried looking on Google, though, to get his first name. But I looked up, I looked up Job, Dr. Denton, and or Job Scholar, Dr. Denton, something like that. And all I got were listings of jobs in Denton, Texas. I think that really says something about the secularization of our society. What book? Anyway, Dr. Denton was convinced that the last part of our reading today, in fact, everything in the book of Job that comes after, where it says Job repents in dust and ashes, was an addition. Was an addition later on put in by the very people that the author of Job was protesting against to make people just feel better about the story that's told in Job. See, the book of Job deals with what's called the problem of evil, which sounds heavy, but it is to a certain extent. But it's the question: why, if God is all good and all powerful, Do bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people? And it's at the center, this question is at the center of a lot of religious speculation, not just theistic speculation, but any religious perspective that tries to make sense out of the world has got to face this issue because it's one that we encounter. The problem of evil, I think, is at the heart of the whole Asian doctrine of karma. It's probably why they needed to invent rebirths to have sort of some payback for doing bad things when it looked like you were dying very rich. It's behind the evolution of ideas concerning an afterlife that are developed in Western religion way beyond what talks about in the Bible. And both karma and the afterlife are ways to make justice seem to prevail, eventually at least, to make things turn out okay, to have a happy ending. Now, it was the insistence that things work out like that Dr. Denton asserted brought on that additional material that is at the end of Job that says, well, he got everything back. In fact, he got better stuff. He got more stuff. He got new kids, and they were better kids. You know, a basic old-fashioned happy ending, at least if you're not too attached to your particular kids who died earlier. The problem of evil is behind sort of the thinking of moral dualism, where influenced by Persian religion, the ideas emerged of a good God and a bad God, engaged in some kind of combat for the world or combat for the human heart in Christianity that gets into the development of a position of the figure of Satan in that way as the Lord of evil, so to speak. But notice the book of Job begins with that kind of wager between God and Satan. And some Christians interpret that as, see, Satan's responsible for evil. But look, in the story, if you read Job, and it's a fictional story, remember, that Satan and God are on pretty good terms. They're just kind of bantering about, you know, bragging. God's bragging about Job, and Satan challenges his response, saying, you know, he's got it pretty good. Of course, he's a nice guy. And it's basically a setup for this story. It's meant to say that Job's misfortunes are not his fault, which is what was claimed by those in charge, Deuteronomy, Job's friends, Job's wife. It's not really trying to claim that misfortune comes from Satan. The main part of the story tells about Job's miseries that have been inflicted on him, and how his friends, his wife, everybody insists that he must have done something wrong. Maybe he needed to go to depth therapy and dig up some repressed memory or something. But he did something wrong, otherwise he wouldn't have lost his wealth and his kids, and his body wouldn't be ridden by disease. But Job insists that's not true. He insists on his innocence. He stands righteously before his accusers, sores and all, before the world, before God, and says, you know, why me? I haven't done anything wrong. It's not fair. Of course, any parent knows, or grandparent knows the response to that statement. Life's not fair, right? Which is what God says from the whirlwind. Life isn't fair. The why of suffering, the why of the bad people prospering and good people suffering, is beyond Job's pay grade. It's not what the leaders at that time said it was. It's more complicated than that, far more complicated. Now, Job's perspective is the inevitable human perspective. We can only see things from the position of our own life, our own ego, and we can only feel our suffering or physical, emotional, mental things that happen to us as something that's happening to our life. But the book of Job tries to carry people beyond that understanding, beyond that perspective, and say, it's not our life. Everything that happens is God's life and the ongoing process of God's creation. That's what the voice from the whirlwind says. No matter how it affects us. Job's life is an aspect of God's life. And how Job may feel about it, how Job may judge it, interpret it, wish it were different, doesn't really make much difference. His life is a part of the pattern of reality. Was Job there, God asks, when the foundations of the world were laid? Is Job the one who created the food for the ravens or the young lions? All that's a mystery. Isaiah says it later, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, says the Lord. If we think that something is wrong with reality, the reality that God has given, then the problem is probably with our thinking and not with reality. Now that's a tough message. It's no wonder that, the religious leaders of the time were sitting around saying, look, you can't end it with that. You've got to give some hope here. You've got to give some people a reason to come to the temple and keep praying and keep donating and all that, But that's basically the point of the story of Job. Job suffers unfairly, complains to God. God says, shut up, you can't possibly understand. And Job repents. He gets it. He repents in dust and ashes, it says. He accepts life on its own terms as it's given and is willing to take his life as it is. End of story. That's the way it is. Have faith in God and do your best. For me, after this many years, that makes a lot more sense than the idea that we can gain some sympathetic magic power that can act a certain way and make God do something for us, or that all we need to do is stop doing something that we're doing wrong and God will change everything for us. Even when we're fortunate and blessed and things do work out, if we take credit for doing that in any way, then essentially we're blaming other people for not doing it right. That's the point of Job. What's not fair is the idea that people are responsible for everything bad that happens to them. They're not. It has a lot more integrity than blaming it all on Satan. I don't have time here to talk about karma and reincarnation, but I'd be glad to make an appointment because I got a lot of ideas about that. Having spent a year in India. The whirlwind in this story, all this happens before our reading, but the whirlwind in the story of Job, from which God speaks, is a pretty good metaphor for the way things really are. And I don't know about you, but more and more, the experience of what's going on is crazy. It's like a whirlwind. But it's not the whole of it, at least not for Christians. It's where probably the book of Job ends. But there's a new covenant coming up. There's some good news along the way. We have next door the library and headquarters for the Monterey Bay Friends of C.G. Jung, the Swiss psychologist that I've been interested in for a long time. But he wrote a book called Answer to Job. And I don't know whether he really says this or whether I just got it while I was reading it rather than from what I was reading, but what I got out of it is that where from the whirlwind, God tells humanity with regards to all the bad stuff that happens to us and the good stuff that happens to people who don't deserve it, God says, you can't possibly understand. But in the life of Jesus, God says to humanity, oh, now I understand. The revelation given in the life of Jesus, the revelation of God with us, doesn't make life less complicated or confusing. It doesn't perform some magic sacrificial act to do away with suffering if you just get it right, or say the right creed, or do the right things. It doesn't eliminate fear. It doesn't eliminate pain. It doesn't eliminate injustice. It doesn't make life fair. But it affirms that God, reality and all what it comes from, the ground of all being, is somehow with us in this challenge, with us in our suffering, with us in our questions, with us in our uncertainty. That when things don't go our way, it's not some mistake that needs to be corrected or sin that needs to be forgiven, or the result of some enemy attack. It's just the hard part of the journey of our own unique life that is a part of God's creation. And in fact, and I know this personally, what may seem the most unfair, what may be hardest in our life, may be a key to the central meaning of our life. That's what we learned from the cross. That awful sense of forsakenness by one who was one in being with the Father is the key to what his life is about. We don't have to like it. Jesus didn't like it. We can cry. We can cry out. But we don't have to cry alone. Our anger isn't futile. Our words might not be obeyed by the universe, but they are heard. They are heard. And they make a difference. The source of all being is right here with us. So maybe our ways are not God's ways. But God has shown us his way in that life and in that death. And as Christians, we find that way in Jesus. God doesn't need us to make excuses for how the world is, to explain away the imperfections of reality and creation. Reality is really its own explanation. It doesn't need justification. Our justifications, our rationalizations, our stories about it, our judgments are all secondhand abstractions that pretty much futilely express trying to grapple on our own with the challenges of life. They're always kind of one step removed from immediate lived experience. But in Christ, God removes that removal, reverses that removal, takes the step back to us to be with us in love. The whirlwind's there. It was there when I came in the church this morning. It's going to be there when I go out. It's going to be there next week, the week after, and on. And we may not understand it. Certainly can't fix it. But with God's love, God's presence in our lives, that very legitimately scary whirlwind can be a wind on which we soar to heaven. Thanks be to God.